Good morning. I call the Committee of the Whole on Bill 36, Health Professions and Occupations Act, to order. We are on Clause 1. Shall Clause 1 pass, recognizing Vancouver-Langara?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and just want to come back to the Minister's response in terms of the DRIP action plan items. Certainly had identified in my second reading speech as well, items 3.7, 4.8, and 4.14. On 3.17, as the Minister and I were discussing, certainly would appreciate the offer to have a separate briefing with the member from Prince George Valemont about the status of the other 21 recommendations in the in-plan site report, including recommendation 24, of course, which does talk about the task team that has a 24-month period to report back on the items in the in-plain site report. But just turning now to the other two items, sections or action item 4.8, could I ask the Minister to reference that action item and describe how he sees Bill 36 as implementing part of that action item 4.8.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. It's good to see you today. Thanks to the member for his question. So I just reminding people, because this is a continuation of a discussion the member and I were having yesterday. So we were discussing these things, but just to remind people, because who don't have the DRIP action plan in front of them, might be listening to us, that section 4.8 is in alignment with tripartite health plans and agreements continue to strengthen and evolve the First Nations health governance structure in BC to ensure First Nations are supported to participate as full and equal partners in decision-making and service delivery at the local, provincial, regional and provincial levels. And importantly, it continues on the need for legislation and engage First Nations and the Government of Canada on the need for legislation as envisioned in the tripartite health plans and agreements. So specifically, with respect to that, as noted in some of our previous exchange, I won't go over these points in detail because we've dealt with them a bit before, that cultural safety is hardwired into every aspect of the regulatory framework in the HPOA. And I think it's important, we sometimes have this discussion in the House. I know I did when I was an opposition member, and members of the opposition raised some of these issues, is that disproportionately this bill, and one of the reasons the bill is longer, I would argue, is that we haven't moved things into regulations. These sections, for example, for the most part, are hardwired into the legislation. In fact, they're stated plainly in the legislation. The regulation sections start towards the end of the bill. We'll have a chance to discuss those. But I think that's an important principle. When people talk about the length of the bill, sometimes bills are reduced in size by moving things into regulation, as we know and as the member will know from many debates in this legislature. So cultural safety is hardwired into every aspect of the regulatory framework. The guiding principles are critical to that. That's section 14.2, and we'll have an occasion to discuss that. The anti-discrimination measures in section 15, making it clear, and this is important, that discrimination is misconduct and actionable conduct. That's section 9 and 11.1c. Revamping the complaints process by enabling restorative processes that could be influenced by Indigenous practices. That's section 157, section 268.1, as well as enabling support workers and access to counseling for people that have experienced discrimination is in the legislation. Clear expectations for regulated health professionals for providing services ethically in compliance with anti-discrimination standards set by the Regulatory College. That's section 72A, in collaboration with one or more persons nominated by Indigenous governing parties and or representative bodies. That's section 384.2C. requiring the superintendent to collaborate with one or more persons nominated by Indigenous governing bodies and/or representative bodies when conducting an oversight process that relates to Indigenous matters. That's Section 467, and that should say that these additions to improve cultural safety were established with Indigenous leaders in BC at both the RFL, which is important in advance of the drafting stage, and then at the drafting stage. And so I think in that sense, the Act follows the recommendations of the DRIP action plan, of our own commitments under In Plain Sight, and reflect the way in which we need to work now and in future. As you know, the DRIP action plan came in the middle of this process of legislation. We were already well engaged with Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders in our own processes, including related to In Plain Sight. All of that said, those action plan items are critically important and reflected in the legislation. I know that we'll have an opportunity to discuss that as we go through the legislation, but we want to have this general discussion under Section 1, and I appreciate the member's question.
Member.
And thank you, Madam Chair, and to the Minister for that response, and appreciate that, again, the Minister has shared various specific sections in the Act in front of us that will speak to many of the items, and this is really framing in terms of the understanding as I get through the balance of my first set of questions here. So just one other point then on the DRIPA action plan, at least, could the Minister also share some basic overview again as to action item 4.14, which does speak to, of course, increasing the availability and accessibility of resources to Indigenous partners, specifically to do with the COVID-19 pandemic health, but as to how the Minister reads that action item to ensure access for all Indigenous peoples to immediate and culturally safe and relevant care closer to home, there's certainly elements there that I'm sure the Minister is focused on for Indigenous nations.
Minister.
Thank you, and I appreciate the member's question. This is legislation, of course. So some of the recommendations of 4.14 are focused on the delivery of services, and by definition, that's not the role of legislation. That said, we've seen a very significant increase in those services, and that's something that I know he and I may wish to discuss, and something he may engage with us to discuss with a response to In Plain Sight as well. But the regulatory framework does do, though, is it addresses how health services are provided, strengthens provisions to ensure they're provided in a way that is free of discrimination and aligned with anti-discrimination principles. And I think across the board that supports those efforts that are really part of, in some cases, budget processes and other processes with respect to services. But it also means and establishes very clear rules as to how health professionals will conduct themselves in that way. And in that way is directly relevant to 4.14 as well. Obviously, we don't do that in legislation. I know the member who's very experienced in these issues understands that.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to just now turn to UNDRIP itself. The Minister referred to, in passing, a significant section of the bill, which we will get to when we get to that section, Section 14, under Division 2, Guiding Principles. But just at the outset, given the nature of the discussion, Madam Chair, we've been having, appreciate the flexibility of the Minister to have it here. Through you, Madam Chair, to the Minister, as I did ask a similar question yesterday in terms of the DRIPA action plan, could the Minister identify under UNDRIP which specific principles are applicable to this particular Bill 36? Obviously, principle Article 24 would be one, but I'd just like the Minister to comment if he can.
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. And we went through some of the ways in which we responded yesterday, so I don't want to repeat that, but I'm happy to share more information with the member. But the UNDRIP articles that I think are touched on here are Article 2, which is that Indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination. UNDRIP Article 3, which relates to the right to self-determination. UNDRIP Article 13.2, that states that states shall take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected, and also ensure that Indigenous people can understand and be understood in the political, legal, and administrative proceedings. The problem, there's more to that, but under Article 15.1, Indigenous peoples have the right to dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, and histories. There's more to that, but the member can refer to that. Under Article 18, which is the right to participate in decision-making in matters that may affect their rights. That's reflected here, and we can describe the alignment, but we probably will as we get to the appropriate sections. But I can, if the member has more questions, I'd be happy to deal with it, but in the interests of time. Under Article 22.1, which has to do with the particular attention being paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. Under Article 24, as he notes, individuals have the right to access without any discrimination to all rights and privileges. And Article 24.1, that Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines, which is also maintained and reflected in the legislation. So those would be the key, I think, provisions of UNDRIP that are reflected in different parts of the legislation. And I'd be happy to go into more detail on those items individually, but I didn't want to, just say in each case where we were to respond, but see where the member wants to take it.
Member.
I think we'll have the opportunity, Madam Chair, to talk about the specific articles of UNDRIP that the Minister has identified here. In terms of the framing of Bill 36, I think that that is a good list to work through as we look at specific items and how they might relate back. But in view of that list of articles that the Minister named, it is the government's view then that Bill 36, in terms of the requirement to align the laws of British Columbia, including this bill as it comes forward with UNDRIP, is the Ministry of the view that it is aligned with UNDRIP?
Minister.
Honourable Speaker, I think it's always important, especially in these matters, to be modest about it. But we feel extraordinary efforts have been made, not just by us, but by Indigenous peoples to ensure that the principles of UNDRIP are reflected, not just in one occasion in the legislation, but across the legislation. And so one of the reasons I wanted to focus on all of the different sections yesterday in response to this, where UNDRIP is reflected, where in plain sight are reflected, is to show that that is woven through the legislation. And I really credit both all of the people who've engaged in the work on this and the consultation on this, and our teams who were open and listening to that work. I talked yesterday, if people were watching or watching today, about the effort to hear and then develop a response and then see if that response actually met not just what we think we heard, but what people wanted to communicate to us. In addition to that, in the core of the guiding principles of the legislation is UNDRIP. And it's section 14.2, and we'll have occasion to get to it. But in exercising powers and performing duties under this act, a person must act in accordance with the following principles. And one of those is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In that sense, it's embedded as a principle in the Act, the guiding principle, but also more than in the guiding principles, because I think a person might legitimately say, well, that's one thing, but also in its sections. And I think that reflects the work that people collectively did to make sure that the Act reflected the kinds of principles that we want to see in the legislation. So we are, relatively early in the passage of the reconciliation bill, and this is a powerful effort to reflect that in an important piece of legislation that touches on people in general, but obviously Indigenous people in particular. And you see that reflected in the legislation. So I'm not sure I'll answer that. I think that we've done everything that we could, because there is always more you can do. But I think a very significant effort has been made here, and I hope that the member agrees with that.
Member.
I must say, Madam Chair, to the Minister, that I've had the opportunity through successive bills and estimate processes to talk to various ministers of the government about compliance with UNDRIP and the DRIP action plan, and the Minister's responses here, I can certainly recognize the level of approach here, which is thoughtful, and I do think that the Minister did hit on a question which I will get to in Section 14 at the appropriate time, around the purpose of the reference to UNDRIP in that particular section. But in going on to identify that there are recognition of the need to comply with the specific articles, that's helpful in the sense that we can see how that is weaved in for clarity and certainty into the legislation that's being presented here. I think that we will have, if I had to pick one though, Madam Chair, to the Minister, of the list of articles that he named, the one particular article I'd just like to spend a few minutes on is Article 18, just to get the sense of the Minister at the outset of this bill review. If the Minister could just give a further explanation, elaborate on how Article 18 is being met, and perhaps give some examples in Bill 36.
Minister.
Yeah, and just to remind people who might be listening to us, and this will be the last answer, I think that we're at time here, and so that gives me a chance to give a longer answer. I'm just kidding. Article 18, Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which affect their rights. And I want to make reference to three sections of the bill where this is relevant. There are others, but three. Section 19, designation assessment of any profession or occupation that must involve Indigenous persons who provide similar types of health services in accordance with Indigenous practices. For instance, the superintendent would not be able to designate Indigenous midwifery, traditional Indigenous medicine, or Indigenous counseling approaches without consulting the Indigenous persons providing that service in accordance with their own traditions, values, and beliefs. This ensures self-determination and how Indigenous health and wellness occupations are regulated. I'd also refer to Section 288, number 288.2. Support workers must be nominated with entities representing Indigenous people, and Section 384.2b, bylaws and rules involving Indigenous matters must be done with one or more persons representing Indigenous communities, right? So those are three examples with respect to Section 18 that are directly relevant to those sections. And we'll have occasion to do it, but having a discussion, and I referred to myself a lot of different sections in this discussion of the proposed Section 1, but it's part of hopefully the exchange that we can have, so the member can deal with that as we come. But I know sometimes he'll have a certain amount of time and place, so we may find an occasion, for example, under Section 14, to have that broader discussion as well. And I'm open to whatever the member would like. And with that, Honourable Speaker, I move that the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
Members, the question is that the committee rise, report progress, and seek leave to sit again. Those in favour, please indicate with aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. The committee stands adjourned.